Hello and welcome to Tech Deal's CPU performance comparison on 4 different computers. We are testing 2 old and 2 new processors today, the AMD FX 8300, the AMD Ryzen 5 1600X, the Intel i7-2600K, and the i7-7700K. Please note that the clock speeds you see on the screen are overclocked clock speeds. They are fixed. There is no turbo, there is no variability, so each of the processors is running constant at those speeds. The 2 older systems have DDR3 1600 and the 2 newer systems have DDR4 3200 MHz memory. All 4 computers have 16 gigabytes of system RAM installed. All 4 computers have an AMD RX 480 8GB card. All are at 1080p, full screen anti-aliasing is on, and very high detail is selected. Fraps was used for the game performance numbers you'll see at the end of this video, but it was not used to record the video you're going to watch. Instead, AMD's Relive software is used to record the gameplay. Very small performance penalty, at most 5%. So if you are streaming or recording your gameplay, this is exactly what you should expect to see. If you are not, add about 5% to the final numbers. The numbers in green at the top left corner of the screen are from MSI Afterburner, a free program you can download and run on virtually any graphics card to get real-time information on what your computer is doing. Now, speaking of those numbers, take a look at the performance that we're currently getting. We are on the FX 8300. I'm starting with the oldest and slowest of the computers. I did a full build video on this computer, linked in the video description below if you're interested in checking out. At the time I built it, which was about 2 months ago, it was a $600 build. You may be able to put it together for even less now because these processors are slowly dropping in price now that Ryzen 7 and 5 have launched. Furthermore, you may very well be able to pick up a used FX processor. It's still a good performer and it still plays many games just fine. That being said, I'm not really including the FX 8300 here because I expect tons of you to go out and buy FX 8300s. It's more here. That was kind of epic. Boom! Well, hopefully that lady didn't need her car back. The real reason I'm including the FX 8300 is for people who already own FX-based systems. Please note, an FX 6300 would be getting exactly the same performance here. A 4300 would not, but a 6300 would, and the same would be said for an 8320, 8350, etc. You can just insert all of the 6000 and 8000 series FX-based chips to get an idea of the performance. So long as you have it overclocked to 4.2 gigahertz, they all perform exactly the same. So the question to be asked is, if you own an FX 63, 8300, etc. series chip, is it worth upgrading? Should you upgrade to an Intel i7-7700K? Should you upgrade to a Ryzen 5 or a Ryzen 7 CPU? Looking at the actual game performance here is just one piece of the puzzle. Now, there's other things you may do with a computer. This is not meant to be an all-inclusive review. Instead, this is going to answer the question, what kind of performance can you expect playing Grand Theft Auto 5 at 1080p at very high detail with an AMD RX 480? Now, please note that if you have an NVIDIA GTX 1060 6GB card, you will get basically the same performance. RX 480 8GB and GTX 1060 6GB are virtually interchangeable in terms of performance. In some games, one card is 5 or 10% faster. In other games, they swap places, but they're roughly equivalent in performance. If you want to play at 1440p, please note, replace the RX 480 with the GTX 1070 and you will get almost identical performance at 1440p. Some games will need a 1080 to get this level of performance at 1440p, but most will be fine with a 1070. Now, if you take a look at those real-time numbers up there, I want you to drop down to the bottom one first. That is our real-time frame rate as well as our frame time. We are getting an average of about 60 frames per second at the moment. Now, it's varying above it and below it. It's not going to hold that constantly. But considering that this CPU is more than 5 years old, or at least the whole 8000 series FX chip line is, that's pretty respectable. Now, the 8300 is a refresh that came out just a couple of years ago, but it's essentially the same chip with a slightly higher clock speed. And since I've overclocked it, well, it's running even faster than that. If you look at the third line, you will see our CPU usage percentage. This is how much of our 8 threads we're using on our chip. A very important point to keep in mind when you are looking at the usage of your processor is the way Windows divides it up is it takes your number of threads, in this case 8 since the 8300 is an 8-thread chip, and it basically divides those out. So 50% would be 4 threads, 25% would be 2 threads, and so on. Now we are above 50%. What does this mean? It means we actually are using more than 4 threads. Now a small piece of that is going to be the fact that I am recording this software. It is using the graphics card, not the CPU to record it, but it still uses some. Furthermore, Fraps recording the performance and MSI displaying numbers in real time is not performance penalty free. It's very low. None of those use very much performance, but they use some. That being said, there's nothing else running on this computer other than this game, MSI Afterburner, Fraps, and then the AMD Relive software recording. This is really using more than 4 threads in many situations. Grand Theft Auto 5 does run smoother on an 8-thread chip, than it does on a 4-thread chip. Not faster, smoother. It doesn't use enough over 4 threads that your average frame rate is going to be dramatically faster. But what you will get is fewer hitches, stutters, hiccups, etc. You know, I don't think that Lamborghini is in great shape. It is a beautiful orange color though. Shame I had to crash into it because I think fencing it's going to be a bit tough. Look at line 4. 16 gigabytes of RAM, we're using just over 8 of it. Now the amount of RAM that we're using is going to vary from machine to machine. They each are complete builds. I'm not just swapping out the processor or motherboard and using the same Windows installation. Each 4 of these machines is a completely separate setup. That being said, all 4 are test machines with clean installs of Windows 10. None of these are personal machines. None of these have a bunch of personal programs running on them. All 4 are test machines with nothing else on them except what I benchmark for the YouTube channel. Move up to line 2 and take a look at our VRAM. We are using just over 4 gigabytes of our video memory on our video card. Now the reality is the 4 gigabyte RX 480 would be doing this just fine. I know it says 4.2 gigabytes being used, but please keep in mind that going over that slightly usually has very negligible, if no, performance impact. It's going way over, half a gig to a gigabyte over, where it becomes a concern. I've played Grand Theft Auto 5 on the 4 gig version of this card. Frankly, it plays just fine. That VRAM usage will go down dramatically, just like that helicopter just did, if you're playing at high detail instead of very high. It's turning the textures from high to very high that really chews through your video RAM. I am filming this in April of 2017. Now, when these cards first came out, there was a fairly hefty price difference between the 4 gigabyte and 8 gigabyte cards. There no longer is. In fact, right now on the day I'm filming this, there is about a $30 price difference between the 4 gigabyte and 8 gigabyte version of the RX 480. For $30, just get the 8 gig version in my opinion. Yes, the 4 gig's enough. Yes, the 4 gig will run basically everything at 1080p. But for $30, when you're already buying a $200 graphics card, in my opinion, just get the 8 gig version. One of the most impressive aspects here is the CPU temperature. This is one of the coolest running CPUs we're going to look at today, and this is the oldest CPU we're going to look at today, 43 degrees Celsius. Now, this was running much hotter when I had this overclocked to 4.5 gigahertz. For any of you who have watched the full build video on this computer, I started off running at 4.5, and it's stable and runs great at 4.5, but it's simply overheated. Part of that is the small liquid cooler. I have a basic 120 millimeter liquid cooler installed. Part of it is I'm running on a very cheap 970 motherboard with exposed voltage regulator modules, and it's really not designed for overclocking. I was going for a budget build, and you can go for a much nicer motherboard with better overclocking and you'll get more performance, but if you have to spend another $50 or $100 to do it, well, maybe just buy a faster processor. I need to do an entire series, speaking of which, regarding value for the money of liquid coolers, motherboards, overclocking, because while it's true that you can get many systems to run faster, if you have to pour $50 to $100 in cooling and a higher-end motherboard to get it, ask yourself, what would that extra $50 to $100 get you if you put it into your video card, if you put it just into buying a faster CPU to begin with? Things to think about is, are you getting value for the money? If you're spending another $100 to get 5 or 10% more performance. Is it worth it? Well, that's a personal choice, and maybe it is to you. And if you're going for the fastest computer you can possibly buy, maybe it is worth it. But I am finding that a middle-of-the-road option coming just under extreme mega performance really gives you a much better value for the money. Speaking of value for the money, that is a jump worth something. I don't know what it is, but that was an awfully far jump. I don't think I completed it successfully, and I have no idea how that card didn't explode hitting the ground at that angle, but that was still kind of epic and cool. Ooh, stunt jump failed. It says stunt jump failed. It doesn't look failed to me. That was pretty epic and pretty cool. Okay, that's enough of the FX8300. I think you get the idea. Now, I did play longer on each of these computers, simply to record a more average frame rate to get a better idea of the performance, but if I showed it all to you, this video would be well north of an hour. As it is, it's going to be about, maybe 30 minutes long, depending on how much I talk later in the video. Now here we are on the Ryzen 5 1600X overclocked to 4.0 GHz. Now you might be saying, overclocked, doesn't the 1600X come with a top speed of 4.0? Yes, it does, but that's a turbo speed. That's really a single core speed. Its base clock speed is 3.6. I do have this on a 240mm liquid cooler, and it's very stable at 4.0 on that cooler. I am running this at 1.4 volts on that cooler. Temperatures are good, so it's fixed all 6 cores, all 12 threads at 4.0, as is the case for all the CPUs in this test. Now, one question people are bound to ask is, why aren't you testing Ryzen 7? Frankly, Ryzen 7 is for content creators, multitasking, virtual machines. It's completely unnecessary, at least in 2017, for gaming. While games will use more than 4 cores, they really don't use 8, or they don't benefit from the difference between 6 and 8. I've done game tests on my Ryzen 7 chips. Between Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 5, there's no difference. Now, if you want to future-proof yourself, if you want to give yourself extra threads and extra cores for future games or for non-Windows tasks, by all means, buy a Ryzen 5 1700 or 1700X. It's going to cost you between $100 to $150 more for that. Motherboard's the same, RAM's the same. The only difference is whether or not you have 6 cores, 12 threads, or 8 cores and 16 threads. As new games come out, I will spot check them on my Ryzen 7 builds versus the Ryzen 5 builds, but the reality is the vast majority of games will show exactly no difference in performance. So if you buy a Ryzen 7, whichever chip it is, and you run it at 4.0 GHz, you'll have exactly the same performance as you see here. Now, if you look at the real-time numbers in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you'll see that the graphics card is basically the same it was in the last run. We're using all of it. We're at, it dips down a couple of times, but there it is, 99%. Our temperature's about the same. Our clock speed's the same. For those of you curious, all but the i7-2600 had the MSI Gaming X RX 480 installed. For various reasons, mostly due to convenience, the i7-2600K had the Asus Republic of Gamers Strix RX 480 8GB card installed. What's the difference? 7 MHz. This one runs at 1303. The Asus Republic of Gamers Strix RX 480 runs at 1310. What's the difference in terms of real-world performance? 0. You'll never notice that. That is the most trivial of trivial differences. So you will see a slight clock speed difference and slight fan speed differences on the 2600K, but there's no performance difference. If you look at the VRAM usage, you will notice that we are a little under 4 GB this time. Different map, different settings in the run. I'm in a different spot. Different things have been happening, so the VRAM usage is going to be a little bit different, but it's still pretty close. It's within 5% of what it was on the previous run. Now look at our CPU usage. Now you'll notice we're below 50%, but we have 12 threads this time, 6 cores, 12 threads, and so that percentage is going to be lower than the FX8300. 50% usage when you have 8 threads means you're using 4 threads or 4 cores. In this case, anything over 33% usage means we're over 4 threads or 4 cores. But since we have 6 real, honest-to-goodness, real processing cores, not kind of cores, not sort of halfway cores, which to be honest the FX does, this will run smoother than the FX or even the i7s will. But the top-end performance may not be there because the individual cores here are simply not as fast as the Intel cores are, especially not the 7700K at 4.7 gigahertz. Now, one question that's bound to be asked, speaking of clock speed, is why didn't I set all 4 machines to run at 4.0 gigahertz? Now, this Ryzen machine will not run at acceptable temperatures and voltage above 4.0. Will it run at 4.1 or 4.2? Yes, if you pour 1.45 to 1.46 volts at it, if you don't care about the temperature of the chip, yes, it will absolutely run a little bit higher than this. But it's not going to run at 4.4 or 4.5. The Ryzen chips just won't do that. The problem is you run into processor longevity problems. You don't want to run the voltages and the temperatures beyond a certain point because, well, frankly, the voltage is the thing that kills chips. But you want your new processor to last a long time. So I'm running this at 1.4, which is the most that I'll run any of the Ryzen chips at. AMD has stated in their press materials that 1.36 volts, which is the top standard overclocking voltage, if you leave it to auto and you overclock your chip, it will snap to 1.3625 volts. Basically, the processors can be run forever at that voltage. They will essentially last indefinitely. Everything fails sooner or later, but it will last way beyond its useful life. Now, at 1.45 volts, AMD stated that their internal testing and modeling indicated that it will run stable and it should last for a long time, but not as long. There will be some processor degradation over time. Now, I read that to say that it will last you for years, but not necessarily decades. That's a little bit much for my taste, so I split the difference between 1.45 and 1.36 and said 1.4 would be my maximum on Ryzen. You may notice there is no temperature for the Ryzen chip here. That is because the Rivia tuner statistics and the MSI Afterburner program don't yet support reading the temperature of the CPU. I expect this to be updated very soon. There's a beta version of it out at the moment, which I don't like using beta versions, especially for benchmarking. But there is, I think I stole that guy's helicopter. And that's going to hurt. I should have crashed. I hit the building and the rotor blades didn't fall off. Go figure. So that's why there's no temperature on the Ryzen 5. There will be on the two i7s, simply because the tools haven't quite been updated. Keep in mind, Ryzen in total has been out for 6 weeks at the time I filmed this, so it's very new. Main system RAM, less than 8 gigabytes. Now, I started mentioning RAM earlier on the previous one. Let me expand on the RAM a little bit. While it's true that 8 gigabytes of RAM is enough to basically run any current game on the market, that doesn't mean they'll all run smoothly, it doesn't mean you'll get the max frame rate, and it doesn't mean that your frame pacing and stutter issues will be as nice as if you had 16 gigs of RAM. Now, I've mentioned this before in many videos, but hey, I'm going to mention it again. Windows will use more RAM than it says it's using. It uses it for disk cache. It uses it to keep frequently accessed files and programs into system memory. When you have everything, all of your RAM used, Windows has to swap things to the hard drive, or it has to keep pulling stuff off of your hard drive or your SSD. In an open world game such as Grand Theft Auto 5, when you're traveling around the world, this causes hitches and stutters as you're driving about and moving about. Now, I completely understand that people may have older machines. If you have an FX 8300, if you have an older i5 or i7 that's 3 to 5 years old, you might have 8 gigs of RAM in it. You might say, wait a minute, I play games, my frame rate seems okay. Sure. Have you tried it with 16? It is very easy to become used to whatever it is you use and just become comfortable with it, and you just take that as normal. If you don't use all these different machines, then whatever you have very quickly seems normal, which is why, frankly, lots of people post, hey, I've got a 5-year-old machine that plays everything great, why would I spend any money? And then the next guy says, oh man, I just bought a new computer and it's wonderful and best investment ever. Another aspect to consider is personal perception. We each perceive frame rates and stutters differently, just like resolution. Some people go, I don't need anything over 1080p, 4K is a waste. Whereas the next guy goes, are you kidding? I just upgraded to 4K, most beautiful screen ever. Our eyes are different, our perceptions are different, so what's important to you may not be important to someone else. Having said that, let's transition to the i7-2600K CPU and see how well it runs Grand Theft Auto 5. Here we are on the i7-2600K. As I mentioned before, this is the Asus Republic of Gamers Strix RX 480 8GB card. You will notice the clock speed First line at the very end is 1310 versus 1303. Does that make a difference? Nope, zero, absolutely none whatsoever. The VRAM is the same speed. Nothing here is really going to be any different. So I simply did this for convenience reasons. I grabbed another one off the shelf rather than bothering to move cards. You will notice that our VRAM usage is only 3 gigabytes, but watch it as we play. It will slowly work its way up as the game loads stuff into VRAM. This is also why it is very deceptive to look at how much VRAM is being reported as being used and think, well, I have to have that or the game won't run smoothly. The games can swap items in and out of VRAM, and it's only when it needs it all at the same time that it becomes an issue. When there's plenty of available VRAM, many games will simply leave everything loaded into it, allocating all the VRAM. That doesn't mean it needs it to run smoothly. Last year, I did a 3GB versus 6GB GTX 1060 comparison, and at the time I basically said there's no need whatsoever for the 6GB version of the 1060. The 3GB version will play everything at 1080p. The only exception is if you want the ability to play some games with ultra textures or 1440p, the 6GB might be worth the investment. But at the time I made that video, there was a $60+ difference between those two cards, just like with the two RX 480 cards. Now that there's a $30 to $40 difference, yeah, I would say just go ahead and get the 6 or the 8GB card. Times change, prices drop, and so the advice changes with it. Notice that we are up to 4 gigabytes of VRAM use. We've only been in this for like a minute. It started at 3 and worked its way up to 4. That's because as I've driven around, as we've seen different cars and pedestrians, it's loading all the textures and elements. There's no need for the game to dump any of that from VRAM because we're not VRAM limited. So there would be a little bit of a lag or delay when loading new elements, but frankly, unless you're constantly fast traveling around the world, it's not going to be a big deal. So don't get too overexcited by what is reported in terms of VRAM use. That is a very nice classic car. It would be a shame if the cops shoot it up. I think it's funny that they keep shooting even though the guy's getting out of the car and they end up killing the owner of the car. The cops are terrible, aren't they? Now, moving on to our CPU usage, notice that we are, just like the FX 8300, over 50%. Now, will this game play on an i7-2600K, which was the 4-core, 4-thread version of this chip? Yes. Will it be just as smooth? Mostly. Not quite, but it will be. Every time you see that go much above 50-55%, especially when it hits 70%, you know the game is absolutely using more than 4 threads. That contributes to its smoothness. Now, they're not real cores, so it's not the same as having the 6-core 12-thread processor of the Ryzen 5, but frankly, it helps. It helps in terms of frame pacing and smoothness. Main system RAM is basically the same as it was before, just under 8 gigabytes, so 16, absolutely 100%, and that's what this has. In fact, this system, I've owned this since new. This used to be my main desktop, and it used to have an i7-2500K in it, and I had it for several years until I replaced it with a 4th gen Haswell, which was more underwhelming than I thought it would be, quite frankly. There were some nice things about moving to a newer motherboard and a newer platform, but frankly, the upgrade from the 2nd to 4th gen, I would not have done it again if I had it to do over again. At the time, I wanted an i7, and so I did go from an i5-2500K to an i7-4770K, but the reality is I could have just gone out and gotten a 2600 and gotten basically the same effect and not had to get a new motherboard and build a new system. Now that actually brings up a really good question. If you have an older i5, a 2nd gen Sandy Bridge such as I did, can you, that's gotta hurt. Can you just go out and buy an i7-2600K, stick it in your machine, and get this level of performance? Probably not, unless you had a Z board, unless you had a 2500K that was on an overclockable board. The issue you will run into is the i7-2600K does not run at 4.5 gigahertz unless you overclock it. Now, impressively enough, I did not have to adjust the default voltages on this at all. I have this basically set to auto. Well, it's set to offset then +0, so it's basically running at auto voltage, and it runs smooth and stable in everything. Look at our temperature, 4.5 gigahertz at 64 degrees Celsius on a 6-year-old processor. The Intel actually used good material on their integrated heat spreader back then. When you see the i7-7700K temperatures at just 200 megahertz faster, 4.7 versus 4.5, In many ways, the latest Intel i7s are actually worse chips than the older ones because of how they were put together with their thermal interface material, with how the integrated heat spreader was attached. Why they made this change, nobody knows. It is true that you can delid and actually take apart a 7700K, change out the material. It's not expensive, it's just challenging, and you run the risk of destroying your processor in the process. I'm not going to do it. I don't recommend most of you do it, but I have seen reports that people who have done it have gotten a 20-degree centigrade temperature drop, which is just nuts. If you can get a 20-degree processor temperature drop by delidding your chip, then what is Intel making these chips out of? That's a topic for a separate time, but it's worth noting that the newest Intel chips run much hotter than the older ones do. Now, speaking of generational changes, look at our performance. We're getting 90 to 100 frames per second here. That is incredible. This is a 6-year-old processor. The Sandy Bridge line debuted in January of 2011. We are now into April of 2017. That is more than 6 years ago. The performance difference between a 2nd-gen processor and a 7th-gen processor is embarrassing. It's embarrassing to Intel, or it should be. The fact of the matter is, a 7700K clock for clock is not even 50% faster than 5 prior generations released 6 years previously. Now, it is true that you can get the 7700K a little bit faster in terms of clock speed. The motherboard is much better. The platform is better. We have USB 3.0, 3.1 support. We've got PCI Express 3.0. We have DMI 3.0. We have NVMe support on the motherboard, M2 slots. There are platform improvements. The real difference is power consumption, and frankly, that's where Intel has put most of their efforts in the past 5 years, not performance. Power consumption. This Sandy Bridge processor is consuming double the power of the Kaby Lake processor. So you will notice a noticeable difference in power consumption between 2nd and 7th gen. That being said, unless you live somewhere where power is really expensive, or you have a lot of these, or you just whatever, the real world difference is a light bulb. I mean, we literally are talking about maybe a 50-watt power difference total between the two machines. So it's real. It is a dramatic power consumption difference. But turn a light off. I mean, it's on an individual basis, it's a pretty trivial difference. But of course, Intel loves to tout their wonderful power efficiency, and it is there, and it's gone to mobile. What it's done is it's made laptops competitive in terms of performance. Intel was trying for a long time to get into mobile in terms of tablets and phones, which completely failed. They poured billions of dollars into that and got absolutely nowhere with it because, well, let's face it, ARM is where it's at in the mobile department. But in any case, that's where all of their efforts went, quite frankly, because it sure as heck was not performance. Now look at this. We're at 90 frames per second, very high detail at 1080p on a $200 graphics card. Yes, you can buy 8GB RX 480s for about $200, and in fact less than $200 after mail-in rebate, if you don't mind such things. Excuse me, kind sirs, I need to borrow that truck of yours after I get done shooting you and your friends. That armor you're wearing doesn't seem to do anything to that rifle. I know, I'm terrible. So, in any case, I think you get the idea here. I continue this for a while. Let's go take a look at the i7-7700K and see what a brand new 7th gen fastest gaming processor in the world gets you. So here we are on the i7-7700K overclocked to a fixed 4.7 gigahertz. I'm going to show you the settings again. I did show them on the very first run just in case you're curious or you missed it at the beginning as to what everything is set to in the detail settings at 1080p. Now this i7 is part of a $1,500 build that I did about 2 months ago or so. A full playlist will be linked in the video description below. This is a very nice system and a very nice build. Now when I first did this, I ran it at 5 gigahertz, but the temperatures were just crazy. We were looking at 90 plus degrees Celsius temperature. Now part of the reason for that is because I used a 120 millimeter liquid cooler in this build. Now you can certainly use a 240 or 280 millimeter cooler, and at some point I plan to move this chip to a larger cooler and actually put it back to 5 gigahertz to see how well that runs. That being said, we're talking about a relatively small, approximately 5 or 6% clock speed difference between 4.7 and 5 gigahertz. So in the real world, in terms of game frame rate, you're looking at less than maybe a 5% difference. You might even only see a 3% difference in performance, and that is assuming you were CPU limited to begin with. So don't get hung up on the even numbers: 4 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, 3.9, 4.0, 4.7, 4.8, and 5 are all roughly the same performance. It's that first number that people sort of hitch on to. Yay, we hit 5 gigahertz, but the difference is really minor in the grand scheme of things. Ever since bringing this down to 4.7 gigahertz, the temperatures dramatically have gotten better. You'll notice here we're at about 70 degrees Celsius. The temperature, the power consumption difference makes 5 gigahertz not worth it, at least not if you don't have a better cooler installed. Now, this is a good cooler in general. I really had high hopes for it. I was a little bit disappointed overall in the numbers. It is the Corsair H80i V2 thick cooler, double the thickness, double fans for push-pull configuration. Again, you can see the full installation and everything in the playlist in the video description below. There's a build video, there's a parts overview, Y vlog, etc., covering every detail of it. If I had the whole thing to do over again, I would have put it into a bit of a bigger case, probably a Master Case Pro 5 instead of the Master Box 5, and I would have put a 240 or 280 millimeter liquid cooler on it. But I was trying to hit the $1,500 price point. I was trying to use some different components. And of course, if you don't try these things, then how are you supposed to see whether or not they're any good? So putting them together and putting this cooler on there is something I did to see what it worked out to be. And honestly, I wouldn't do it again this way. So if you watch that build video, spend a little bit more on a better cooler and a better case if you want to get maximum overclock. Speaking of overclocking and clock speed, something I was talking about earlier in the video, and I don't think I quite got back to, was why do I not have all 4 of these machines running at a fixed 4.0 gigahertz? Because nobody would run them that way. Even if you didn't overclock this 7700K, it's not going to be at 4.0 because it has a base of 4.2 out of the box with a turbo to 4.5. Underclocking it just to equalize the CPUs tells you what? Nothing. Nobody's going to run a 7700K at less than 4.2 because that's the default out-of-the-box speed, and nobody's going to be running a Ryzen 5 at 4.2 short of not caring about their processor because the temperatures and voltages are too high. This is not about equalizing and finding out exact per core, per gigahertz, per IPC instructions. This is not some scientific test designed to determine in laboratory conditions what are the relative merits of these CPUs in some hypothetical circumstance. I want to know, if you go out and buy these chips and run them at the speeds they'll run at, what will you get in terms of real-world performance? That's all that matters. Synthetic, pretend, maybe, hypothetical, it would be nice to dream about benchmarks. Who cares? It's the same reason I'm not running these CPUs at higher voltages and temps. It shortens their life. I test and benchmark things in the real world conditions that I recommend people actually run. What will you get if you buy or do X that I show you? So I try to keep the theoretical stuff to a minimum. This is why I don't get into too many technical details about the transistor counts and production processes, and I haven't talked, for example, a lot about Infinity Fabric and some of the new things in Ryzen. I know a lot of other reviews, and I'm not knocking it, it's interesting. But a lot of reviews on, for example, Ryzen have talked about the technical details of the chip, how many transistors are on the chip, the new production process, the new Infinity Fabric which connects the cores. Who cares? You never see it, you never use it, it doesn't make any difference to the end user. All I want to know is, does this chip run my programs and my games at good performance? Is it easy to install and set up? Is it dependable? Does it run stable? Does it not crash? Does Windows work? And is the price reasonable for what I'm getting? That's what I care about. That's the focus of my channel, the deal, which is why I don't talk about things like that. I have not, for example, mentioned the fact that the 2600K is a 32 nanometer chip and the 7700K is a 14 nanometer chip. Well, okay, I just did, but I did 30 minutes into the video. That doesn't matter. All that matters is, how well does this play my game? How well does this run? Is it stable? Is it smooth? That's really, in my opinion, what counts. Back to the benchmark numbers, our VRAM usage is about 4 gigabytes, just like it was on all the others. Our CPU usage has been bouncing around. Now, at the moment, it's a little bit below 50%, but it will bounce up a little bit. Now, the higher instructions per clock cycle and the higher efficiency of this chip certainly means it's going to be lower than the 2600K, but when you look at the minimum, maximum, and average frame numbers at the end of this video, you'll notice it's not as different as maybe a lot of people might think it is. There's more theoretical performance in a 7700K than a 2600K. There's more future-proofing. Would I go out and build a new 2600K machine tomorrow? No, not really. In fact, the only reason I put a 2600K onto my old machine was for my YouTube channel. I never would have otherwise. In fact, that machine was previously being used as a home file server with its i7-2600K, and I had actually retired it almost about a year ago, and it was sitting on the side. I really should have sold it. I just never did for whatever reason. I brought it out of retirement, set it back up, swapped the CPU out to use it for benchmarking purposes. That's it. All right, I think we've seen enough gameplay. Why don't we take a look at the results? Here we are. The FX 8300 averaged over 60 frames per second, but it does not hold a candle to the other machines. The other three computers are all basically the same in the 85 to 90 frame per second range. The R5-1600X, the i7-2600K, and the i7-7700K. Now, it is true that the 7700K was the fastest chip here, but it also has a 700 MHz clock speed advantage over the Ryzen 5 chip. The extra cores and threads of the Ryzen 5 really don't make a serious difference in gaming at the moment. Many people might say, well, shouldn't I then buy a 1500X? In my opinion, no. If you're building a new machine and you're going the Ryzen route, get the 6-core chip. It's worth the extra money over the 4-core version of the Ryzen chips, at least for the Ryzen 5. Ryzen 3 we'll take a look at when it launches later this year. Now, if you still have an i7-2600K and you're in the 4.5, even 4.2 gigahertz clock range, keep gaming. There's no reason to upgrade that. If I had bought an i7-2600 instead of an i5-2500K 6 years ago, I might not have bought a Haswell. So spending the extra money to get a better chip means you keep your computer longer without having to upgrade, which is exactly why I think the 1600 is worth buying over the 1500. The 6 cores will give you longevity. Now, some people are going to say, well, shouldn't I then get an R7? Maybe. I don't think that's going to be as necessary, and it costs a lot more money, between 100 to 150 more. But if you don't mind spending the money and you want some future-proofing, it's worth considering. The two big takeaways from this is the fact that if you have an FX-based processor, either a 63, 83, any of the FX chips, is it worth upgrading to get better gaming performance? Yes. The reality is both Ryzen and Intel offer better gaming performance across the board in most situations over the FX series of processors. Now, it does depend upon the game. It depends on whether you're graphics card limited. You will need a relatively up-to-date graphics card to play the latest and greatest games, or you'll just put the bottleneck on your graphics card if you have something that's a few years old. However, there is a substantial noticeable difference in both gaming and Windows use between the FX chips and everything else. If you're still using a 5 or 6 year old i5 or i7 chip, you frankly don't need to upgrade. What you need is a graphics card. If you have a 3 to 5 year old graphics card, a new graphics card in a 2nd or 3rd gen i5 or an i7 will frankly play all the current games on the market today. Upgrading your CPU will not get you a better gaming experience. The real reason to upgrade to either a 7700K or a Ryzen 5 or Ryzen 7 chip is non-gaming use. Content creation, multitasking, Windows performance. Those processors are faster in those tasks. Running Windows updates, running web browsers, doing content creation is faster on a 7700K versus a 2600K. But frankly, if you're doing any of those tasks, I can tell you that the R5-1600X crushes the 7700K. So frankly, if you have a 5-year-old machine and you want to upgrade, I struggle to find any reason to buy anything other than the Ryzen 5 1600. Notice that I said 1600 and not 1600X. Now, there's nothing wrong with the 1600X, but the deal is the R5 1600. Use the included stock Wraithspire cooler. Set it to 3.7 instead of 4.0 gigahertz. You will give up 2 or 3 frames per second. You'll never notice it, and you will save yourself a bunch of money. To get 4.0 gigahertz, I'm running a $100 240 millimeter liquid cooler on a $250 CPU. $220 buys you the R5 1600. No cost for a cooler because it's included, and it runs great at 3.7. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big huge red button directly below. Post your comments below the video, and as always, check out the video description. Links to everything is mentioned down there. You're going to find links to my full playlist on my builds down there. The FX8300, the Ryzen 7 build. I haven't done the 1600 yet. I will soon. The i7-7700K. Links to Amazon and Newegg for all these items will be down there as well. If you like my channel, then please use those links when you're buying. I would greatly appreciate it. Finally, consider supporting me on Patreon. If you found all this analysis and background information useful and helpful, if you like my channel and you want to see more of it, every dollar donated on Patreon will go straight into making more videos for you. The link to Patreon will be down below as well, and I would greatly appreciate any support you can provide. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video.